In our shaky, smoky, creative, courageous, fragile city. I'm Bronwyn Hayward from the Department of Political Science at the University of Canterbury. It's been a very tough few days, and it's been a very tough few years. Christchurch understands very well what it means to live well, and what prosperity means. What makes a meaningful life is focused very quickly when you have 5 minutes to evacuate what matters, your people, your pets, your Plunkett books, your photos. How to live well is a conversation that Christchurch has had often. And so it is a pleasure today to do two things. The first is to introduce Professor Tim Jackson. For many here, Tim's work will need no introduction. He's Professor of Sustainable Development at Surrey and Director of the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity, which is an ESRC Millennium Research Grant. He's also the Professorial Fellow on Prosperity and Sustainability in the UK. And closer to home, he is the current Hillary Laureate for his exceptional international leadership on sustainability. And I'd like to thank the Hillary Institute very much for making Tim's travel possible. On top of all that, he's a dramatist and an award-winning playwright. I first met Tim exactly 10 years ago when he was the Environment Commissioner Economics for the UK and was brought out to New Zealand by Morgan Williams, our then Environment Commissioner, and we were speaking together at an event. After that, I joined the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change in the UK for 3 years, and Tim invited me to be a research fellow with Resolve, his first research institute in the UK on sustainability, but not his first overall, because he'd also worked extensively in Stockholm before that on sustainability and environment. After that, I joined as a fellow with the Sustainability Research Centre, SLRG. And then recently it's been both a privilege and a pleasure to be a co-investigator with the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity, which brings me to the second purpose of today, which is to launch our own University of Canterbury Centre for Civic Imagination and Sustainable Citizenship, a deeper collaborating partnership between colleagues, and I'm delighted that 4 of our first funded PhD students are here as well, and the city. And it's great to be actually able to be in the city for the first of a series of public lectures. We'd also like to thank Leanne Gazeel for agreeing to chair our advisory board, and for Rafe Manges for agreeing to represent the city. And we look forward to leading discussions about what it means to live well. This has been a radical city. It's a city in which, when you think about nearly all, other than perhaps Parihaka, the major developments in New Zealand democracy, the women's vote, MMP, just to name 2, but the nuclear-free movement, the key role that the city played in the Springbok Tour movement, the way in which we have actually fronted up and led on many of the treaty settlements. This has been one of the key cities in which most of the innovative democratic ideas have happened from. So it is a great privilege and pleasure to introduce Tim Jackson today to talk about his work on prosperity living.
Thank you very much, Bronnie. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here and to have been here amongst the beauty of New Zealand and in particular the Christchurch area, and also the difficulties of the Christchurch area and everything, particularly in the last few days, and as Bronnie said, in the last few years that you've had to cope with. And as Bronnie was talking, I was reminded of a writer called Ernest Dichter, who was describing the flow of refugees from a natural disaster at the time. And he was describing that flow of refugees for the purposes of getting his audience to understand the importance of material things. And he described them, he described hollow hands clasping ludicrous possessions, because they are links in the chain of life. Without them, we are truly lost. And he was capturing something quite profound about our relationship to material things, that we cathect them, in the words of Russell Belk, a psychologist. We draw them towards us, we extend ourselves out towards them. It's a little bit like when you're driving a car. When you first get into an unfamiliar car, you don't know where the boundaries are, but after a little while, actually you know where the front end and the back end is, and there's something in the human psychology that enables itself to meld almost with material things. And we don't just meld in meaningless ways with material things, we meld in very, very meaningful ways. The precious gifts that our parents gave us, that we cling to because they're no longer there, or the comfort blanket from our first child, or the presents that our peer group gave us as a kid at school. In numerous ways, we attach ourselves to material things and they become a part of our lives. They become a part of a symbolic conversation. We tell each other stories through material stuff. And this telling of stories is an important part of our culture, and it's an important part of our world. And yet, on the other hand of the coin, other side of the coin is a darker story, a story of overconsumption and hyper-materialism, a story of being too attached to material stuff, a story of giving over our social relationships almost entirely to material things, and having to work so hard to earn those material things that we no longer have the time that we would like to create the relationships that the material things are supposed to be symbolizing. A kind of perversity, a kind of dystopia. And this bipolar relationship that we have with material things is at the core of understanding both how we have misconceived prosperity and how we could reconceive it, how we could think differently about that relationship to material things, how we could think differently about prosperity itself. What does prosperity really mean? And that was a task that set me out personally on a quest back in 2004 when I was appointed as Economics Commissioner on the Sustainable Development Commission. And as Bronnie said, I've worked in all sorts of places on sustainability and been inevitably drawn towards economics and the key features of economics as those institutional architectures which defined our choices, which set out our course of travel, which curtailed our possibilities sometimes, which determined whether a low-impact renewable energy source was installed as opposed to a huge fossil-fired power station with all the damage that that might cause, determined by economics. Or the choices that a business faces when it's trying to reduce its carbon footprint or its water footprint or the damage it's creating in the environment. All of it somehow coming back to economic principles. What are the costs? What are the benefits? How do we measure those costs? What do we include in the cost-benefit equation? All of these things coming through the economic institutions that surround us, that embed us in the kind of society that we have. And it became increasingly clear to me, as I was thinking about economics and its relation to sustainability, that it is the core of our needs for reformation. We have a dysfunctional economics. We have an economics that's caused inequality. We have an economics that has trashed the environment. We have an economics, actually, which has misinterpreted the underlying motivations of those refugees and their hollow hands, the underlying motivations of solidarity, of social concern, of friendship, of the love of our families, all somehow cashed out in terms of material possessions that our economy says, our economics says, is the primary basis of prosperity. And you can sort of begin to see what's going on here, that actually economics has confused the means to prosperity with the end of prosperity. What prosperity is, ultimately, is about our human relationships. It's about our solidarity. It's about our prospects for the future. It's about our care for each other. It's about the love of our friends and the security of our family. It's about our prospects in the future. And it's about our traditions in the past. And thinking about prosperity in the round, it is such a rich and varied concept that it's almost nonsensical to simply cash that out in one-dimensional, material, or even economic terms. These are not things that hold monetary value very easily. They're things that we resist attaching monetary value to, because the love of our friends is something that is unique to us as individuals, is unique to us within a relationship, that's unique in terms of its value, that resists this idea that it belongs to an economy of exchange and trade, that we can somehow trade off the value of a friendship that is no longer there for some material consolation. And yet the society that we live in encourages us, tempts us, persuades us, attempts to persuade us continually to do that, to make that trade. And in the process, what happens, of course, is that we tend to lose that underlying importance, that relationship, that social contract, that part of us that actually is beyond price and beyond value and connects us to each other as human beings. These were, if you like, very philosophical projections and contemplations, and ones that, of course, we can all engage in and we can all understand. We can all relate to these understandings in some way. And yet, to make progress, there are more difficult tasks. And those difficult tasks involve understanding the bigger relationships between economics and sustainability, the bigger relationships between income and well-being. And even if income isn't the same thing as well-being, perhaps it's such an important means towards well-being, towards prosperity, that we should take it a little bit seriously. And these were the kinds of reflections that when I was doing the work in the Sustainable Development Commission, I was able to follow through and to, for example, look at the relationship between basic fundamental aspects of sustainability, of prosperity, and their relationship to the economy that is supposed to sustain them. Here's an example of that. It's a very simple graph of life expectancy, how long we expect to live, against the income per capita. And what you can see in this graph tells a host of really important stories. Amongst those stories is that where income per capita is rather low, increasing that income is incredibly effective in terms of improving prosperity. So life expectancy practically doubles as income goes from nothing to around $20,000 per capita. What does this tell us? It tells us quite specifically that prosperity without growth is likely to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, in the poorest countries in the world. Prosperity without growth is not a message for the poor, rural, sub-Saharan Africans who are without decent sanitation, without clean water, without secure energy supplies, without proper housing, without decent nutrition. Prosperity without growth is just a chimera to people who don't have those things. It's an illusion, and we certainly couldn't really, with any moral decency, stand up and tell poor countries they shouldn't grow because there's not enough space in the world. But is that a story that we could perhaps say to ourselves? Could we actually say, maybe your prosperity gains as you get richer are diminishing, sort of diminishing returns to growth? And this is actually another story from this graph. It's a story that says actually the returns to growth in terms of life expectancy tail off quite fast beyond a certain point. And on the right-hand side of the graph, you can see countries like the UK, the USA, Ireland, with life expectancies less than in Costa Rica, in Chile, in Cuba, on a fraction of the income in those poorer countries. It's a story that gives us a possibility that actually there may be ways of setting up society where you can achieve the prosperity gains without the need for the continual exponential growth in income. But it's also a story, a picture, a graph with a puzzle. And the puzzle is, if this is really the case, if we're chasing growth on the right-hand side of the graph without delivering the prosperity that we'd like from it, why on earth are we still doing it? And it might be just an intellectual puzzle, were it not for the fact that actually we can't afford to chase growth that is not delivering prosperity. And we can't afford to chase that growth because of the ecological impacts of it. And they don't have to spend very much time on that to make the case. The Paris Agreement in November last year, for example, settled almost amazingly out of the blue on an aspirational target to limit climate warming to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average. And nobody, I think, none of the politicians certainly, and only a few of the scientists really understood what that actually means, the challenge of that. They understand, of course, that that's what we need. That's what we need to keep our climate in decent shape and our, the security of our environment going forwards. But actually, the technological challenge is immense. The global carbon budget for a 1.5 degree target is 240 billion tons of carbon dioxide. In total, that's all there is left to burn, according to the scientific knowledge, if we are to stay in that range, that 1.5 degree range. And the trouble is, at the moment, we're burning carbon dioxide at the rate of about 40 billion tons a year, and you don't have to be a genius to do the maths. 240 divided by 40 is 6, and even if we got the numbers slightly wrong, we're talking about a decade or so to change the technological basis of our society and to create a fossil-free, a carbon-neutral society. So the ecological challenge is huge. As Bill McKibben once said, before we run out of resources in the ground, we're already running out of planet. All of that was input to the work that I was doing in the Sustainable Development Commission. And it was input that allowed me to discuss the huge importance of understanding that the means to prosperity is not the same as the end itself, as prosperity itself. I have to tell you that the original report, which was a report to government, was not particularly successful in its own terms. In fact, the UK government was decidedly put out when the report was published. I even had a phone call on the Friday before the report was published from a very irate government official, one who I'd been working very closely with, who told me in no uncertain terms that number 10 in a certain street in London had gone ballistic. So that was kind of not what we had necessarily intended. In fact, we'd gone out of our way to ask number 10, one of the advisors in number 10, you know, can we call this report Prosperity Without Growth? This is what we're saying, this is what we've done, are you okay with the title? And the advisor somewhat disingenuously said, I don't think it matters what you call it. And the advisor in question was on a plane to China when the report was actually being launched. So on that Friday evening, I was exposed to the visceral fear of the politician in relation to those two words, without growth. And it was not a comfortable place to be. And economists and the mainstream politicians subsequently, to be absolutely fair, have not really changed from, they haven't got beyond that visceral fear. So if you're talking about resources running out, then sorry, I'm not that interested to hear. If you're talking about climate change, I'll sign an agreement, but I don't really want to understand what it means in practice. If you're worried about the social aspects of prosperity and whether they really correspond to money, that's a philosophical consideration. I'm not kind of going to waste my time doing it, because what I want to do, I'm busy doing, is kick-starting growth again after the worst financial crisis that we've seen in many decades. And then something strange happens. The kick-starting of growth becomes absolutely the focus of attention, but isn't so easy to achieve as the politicians hoped. There was a little bit of kicking, but not much starting. There was a lot of desperation, but not much on the ground, real investment in the productivity of an economy that looks resilient. In fact, and this is where things became very, very interesting in the wake of the publication of that first report, it began to dawn on conventional economists, irrespective of all of these ecological things that you worry so much about, you greenies, and irrespective of all of the philosophy of whether growth is good for us as human beings, that actually economics itself was moving into a kind of new normal, an idea that there might be secular limits to the expansion of the economy. And this is a very, very different place to be. This isn't where I started out when I was writing that report. It's not the reaction of government when I launched it, but in the intervening years, some 7 years or so, a gradual realization amongst economists that we may not just be able to pursue this exponential year-on-year percentage growth forever. And if we didn't, we would have to start rethinking what the economy was for, what it was about, how it worked, and how we would solve all the challenges of a society in which economic growth has stalled. This is a graph of labour productivity growth, and it goes from 1900 to 2012. And it tells a story. It tells a story of how enormous productivity growth gave us an expanding economy, delivered all kinds of improvements in quality of life, up to about the mid-1960s. And in fact, the peak year itself is 1966, which of course for an English person is a kind of a peak year. And they think it's all over, it is now. And the descent past 1966 is extraordinary to see. Partly it's extraordinary because it's steeper than the incline, and partly because it's been going on for so long. So actually what's slowing down the economy and giving us problems isn't fundamentally a crisis that happened 7 years ago. It's a trend that happened 6 decades ago, 5 decades ago-ish. And at the point at which we are now, we're looking at labour productivity growth that is virtually zero and in some years negative. Now that's an extraordinary place to be. It's a story of the UK, but you can do the stats for the advanced economies as a whole. Advanced economies are not growing like they used to do. They're not growing like economists would like them to do. So what are we going to do about that? Are we going to push harder at inequality? Are we going to invest more in spurious trading and casino economies? Are we going to exploit the value of labour further and further? Are we going to create the disrest, the unrest and discomfort of financial crises going forwards? Are we going to build an economy that doesn't work because we don't know how to do better? Work as a form of servitude, the division of labour to extract as much value from it as possible. Investment, simply as speculation. Money as a form of power. Enterprise as a relentless accumulation of stuff and throughput of materials. An economy that doesn't work. Or are we prepared, actually, to think beyond this privatization of benefits and socialization of costs and be inventive? And this for me, is the principal development of prosperity without growth since those early years, is to think irrespective of those arguments about ends and means, irrespective of the arguments about the benefits and disbenefits of growth, irrespective of the difficulties associated with rethinking economics. How would we set about that task? What can we put in place? And my argument, it's the argument of the second edition of the book in particular, is that we can and should and must engage in that task, and that it is definable, it is clear, it is meaningful, and it's pragmatic, ultimately, to ask questions of these foundations and to build something different. Let's start with a very simple thing. Up to a point, material stuff matters to us. But ultimately, the quality of our lives is determined by all sorts of things, not just material. And indeed, even when it comes to material things like food, it isn't necessarily the case that more is better. We live in a world which is divided between lifestyle diseases and obesity and amongst the rich economies, and undernutrition and starvation amongst the poorest. And that is exactly the tension between thinking about prosperity as more and thinking about prosperity as sufficient. And beyond the sufficiency of those material things, actually it's services that improve the quality of our lives. Actually, nutrition itself is a kind of service. Energy can be construed as a service. We don't want coal, oil, gas leaking into the building, filling up our halls. We want the services that that provides. And beyond the material things, we want health, we want education, we want social care. We want the craft that goes into long-lasting objects. We want the creativity that builds artistic endeavour. We want gardens and museums and public spaces. We want the service of protecting our ecosystems. And this idea, this radical revision of what enterprise is, provides a foundation to think about service activities, resource-light activities that provide people with the capability to flourish, to tread lightly on the earth, to deliver a good quality of life, to be integrated into the community, and perhaps most interestingly of all, to provide decent, satisfying employment. Employment actually matters. You can look at this in a graphical form, and what you find is that on the right-hand side of my graph, very close to the bottom, is an area of service-based activities that includes all of the things that I've mentioned in that previous list as the things that we might relish in a new economy. And what is interesting about that is that the horizontal axis there is the employment intensity of activities. You'll see that those service-based activities are amongst the most employment intensive. They are employment rich. They employ more people per unit of output than some of the other activities around manufacturing and construction and mining, and they are much lower in carbon. So are we perhaps looking at a sector of the economy that we would want to grow, we would want to flourish, we would want to have more of? Are we looking at a way of keeping people employed with low carbon outputs that is genuinely delivering satisfaction, that's genuinely delivering a quality of life? And what would that consist of? It would consist of those services that I was articulating before. It would consist of craft and care and culture, activities that improve our lives without destroying the environment and employ people as we go along. And one of the reasons that's so important is because, as it turns out, work itself is an aspect of prosperity. It's about our participation in society. It's a kind of a glue that keeps society together. It's the way that we deliver our services towards other people. It's the way that we connect to other people It's the way that we have some sense of self-worth. It's the way that we build and co-create society together, work as a participation, a meaningful participation in society. Again, you take one of those economic concepts with all its difficulties and its damages, and you transform it into something that will give us a better sense of prosperity. And it's a fantastic idea in principle. The reality is, of course, that people have often meaningless dead-end jobs with no security, 0 hours contracts, if they're lucky. And in the wake of the financial crisis, up to 50% of young people in Europe were unemployed. Half of a whole generation unable to participate in society in that way. A tragedy of enormous proportions, not just because those people miss out on prosperity, but because society misses out on the things that people can bring to it, the prosperity that people can bring to it. And there's a sense here, actually, of almost disbelief when you look around at that tragedy and you say, hang on a minute, are there no ill people left to care for? Is there no mental health issues in society? Is there nothing to be done to protect any ecosystems anywhere? Are there no kids who need educating? Are there no people with learning disabilities who need a bit more time spent with them to integrate them into society? Is there no artistry left to do, and there's no creativity that we want anymore? And the answers are always, so obviously, no, 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 and no. There is a huge demand for participation for these people who are being excluded from society. And so there is clearly a transformation that is worth engaging in. We can't do that without reforming some of our other economic concepts. One that I'm particularly fond of, in terms of its ripeness for being reformed, is the idea of investment. Investment in the degenerative economy that led to the crisis and led to ecological damage is a form of gambling. It's a form of casino investment, of betting on the prices of future assets, on betting on commodities, on betting on the extraction of damaging materials from the environment and their ability to degrade the planet at the other end of their life, and betting on the prices of our houses going up and up and up, on betting on the value of the shares in our companies performing in the direction that we want them to. Betting even on, sometimes, as happened in the crisis, on the fact that that will not happen, that they will fail. We have derivatives, we have instruments in the modern economy that allow people to bet against our own success as a society and to profit from it. It's almost an abhorrent sense of investment. And actually, investment is and should be the most fundamental relationship in economics, because it embodies our relationship, the relationship between the present and the future. It should be an act of commitment, a commitment to the prosperity of the future. And to do that, we have to articulate the portfolio of projects that we should be investing in. And as we look around, are there such projects? I have no idea where they might be. Actually, it's obvious. The portfolio is there. It's about investing in the transition to a low-carbon economy. It's about investing in public infrastructure. It's about investing in the ecological assets without which our economies are nothing. It's about investing in the sectors, the services, the arts, the crafts, the care, the education that form the basis of the prosperity that we hope for tomorrow. All of this portfolio is there, and it's there waiting for investment. It's demanding investment. And very, very slowly, from the smallest local community companies to the biggest institutional investors trying to create ethical funds for pension holders, these changes are beginning to take place. And this has been another of my lessons since the first volume of Prosperity Without Growth was published, and I've worked over these intervening years with some of these people at each of these levels. Absolutely frighteningly bright economics graduates who get the point and who are beginning to try and change the system. A need, of course, to take that further. Acceptance, of course, that it doesn't yet transform the environment, the landscape of investment entirely, but a starting point, again, a transformation of a dysfunctional casino-based gambling investment towards something that is a commitment to our future. A way of thinking differently about economic fundamentals, a transformation of economics. We can't do that, of course, without a decent money system. And here is, in some ways, the most important and the most difficult of the messages, the lessons from developing prosperity without growth, that the money system has us by the short and curless. I was trying to think of something slightly less obscene. It is a very graphic and very useful description, and it's exactly the truth. It's a strange place for ordinary people to understand, for reasons that I'm going to come to. But once again, we can identify alternatives. Alternatives to a money system in which 97% in the UK and above 90 in almost every advanced economy, 90% of money is created by commercial banks at interest, charging interest on the creation of a social good. How could we bypass this structure? And a lot of people have begun to do that. So a lot of these initiatives that you can see here, peer-to-peer lending, community bonds, lovely small-scale challenges to that existing domination of commercial credit creation. Institutional investors and the transformation of our portfolios I've already talked about. And at the macroeconomic level, actually demands action from government. It demands financial regulation that stops this credit creation causing the financial difficulties that it caused in 2008 to 2009. That imposes and changes fiduciary duties, that says actually it's the right thing for shareholders to do, not to maximize their own profits, but actually to maximize value to society. You can impose all sorts of lovely ideas like greening quantitative easing and hypothecating transaction tax, which is a very sort of economic way of saying that you charge people for having all these financial transactions and you put that money that you've charged them to work investing in small-scale initiatives. And ultimately, a reform of the banking system is what's needed. And if it sounds too good or too difficult, these are some of it. It's one of the lovely examples, a very, very small-scale thing, which is just connecting savers, ordinary people like you and I, to projects in the sustainability portfolio that individuals can invest in. You don't have to throw your money at big funds and say, please invest it, and don't tell me where it's going because I don't really want to know how bad it all is, just give me the return, thank you. You can actually engage in this activity of commitment at the individual level. Or you can create this sort of vehicle. Shared interest is the financial vehicle that underlies fair trade. Fair trade would not have happened as a community movement, as a consumer movement, without the vehicle of shared interest, which was the financial mechanism that allowed profits to be shared along the supply chain in a fair way. It's well enough, said Henry Ford in the 1920s, that the nation he was talking about, the US, don't understand banking and finance. But if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. The way that money is created, the way that it's created through commercial credit, the way that commercial credit attracts interest, the way that interest enriches those who have the power over the money creation, is a system that survives public scrutiny only because it is so complex and so difficult to understand, and actually has been systematically misinterpreted by economists right up to the crisis. And it was only actually at the crisis and after the crisis that people began to ask the questions, do we really understand what's going on in relation to our money system? And answering it, actually, no. Even mainstream economists, even mainstream economic textbooks don't really talk about the money system in a clear way or with an understanding. They regard it simply as being about the liquidity of putting enough cash through the system to keep growth going. But that is not the case. The reality is that money is created by banks of interest that enriches a minority, and when things go wrong, it is the public sector who has to bail out the architects of chaos. And that is a strong statement, but it is not one in which I'm alone. This is Milton Friedman talking in 1948. A reform of the monetary and banking system, he said, would eliminate both the private creation or destruction of money and the instability associated with public debt, and has strong economic foundations. Milton Friedman, the architect of the Chicago School, one of the most conservative schools of economics, recognized that in the case of money, we have the wrong principles in play. The idea, actually, that there is such a long pedigree for this idea, for this revision of a money system, is something that I had not taken into account at all when I wrote Prosperity Without Growth. I knew vaguely about it, I'd worked with some of those who worked with it, but it wasn't actually until I was approached after one of my lectures by a couple of bright graduate students who decided it was time to make this a public issue and set up, off their own bat, an organisation called Positive Money to change the monetary system and to make that a single issue of importance, that I began to realise not only that young people are much more intelligent and faster than I am anymore, but also that actually there is a key here, a key way of reforming that last building block in the foundations for a sustainable economy. A way of doing something better, a way of building an economy that works, workers' participation. Money as a social good, enterprise as service, investment as our commitment to the future, an economy of care and craft and creativity. Of course, you have to, and this is really sad because it's such a horrible subject, you have to come back to macroeconomics. And I know that you just want a lecture in macroeconomics because it's the only thing standing. Somebody does, that's great, between you and lunch. I'm going to show you just one very simple example of why that is so useful to have. And it's one that we set about doing. We asked ourselves a whole bunch of questions about the macroeconomics of a post-growth economy. Is it possible at all? Can you employ people? Yes, maybe you can if you shift them into employment-rich sectors. But what about these fundamentals like credit creation? Can you even have a no-growing economy when you're still charging some interest on debt? And then let's forget that that charging of interest on debt is not about the meaningless credit creation of the money system alone. It's also about anything which suggests that we invest as saver to borrower in a reformed economy. And if it was something as fundamental as the interest rate that was standing in the way, then we could never get to this place in the future. So with the help of an economist called Peter Victor, who I worked with very closely over the last few years, we began to ask some of these questions. And the most extraordinary thing is that the answers not only confirm for us, it's not a very interesting place, but it is a theoretical possibility that an economy can be absolutely flat with a positive interest rate, but began to tell us other things about the economy as well. What happens if we shock this economy? Will it come back to equilibrium, do you think? Will it, if we say suddenly there's a shock in consumer demand, or will it go off into space somewhere? Well, it looks as though under our business as usual assumptions, you can shock it, it comes back nicely into its equilibrium. Post-growth economy is still at this point possible. But what if we have, let's take, say, John Maynard Keynes' idea of animal spirits, which is exactly what undid us during the crisis. A set of responses by businesses. When things are going well, we invest more and more and more and create these bubbles. When things are going badly, we just withdraw investment and everything stagnates. What if we exacerbated that function of the system and put it into this shock situation? Really interesting. What we found was, yes, it's destabilizing. We can destabilize the system in all sorts of ways very, very easily. You can destabilize most systems if you try hard enough. And then the question is how would we respond to that? One of the most interesting macroeconomists, John Maynard Keynes, and a closely related macroeconomist called Hyman Minsky argued that there is a fundamental role, a stabilizing role, for government spending. And the way that it should work to stabilize is that as you go above the growth rate that you want, government recognizes that we're in a boom time and it spends slightly less. When you go below that growth rate, government spends more. And this counter-cyclical spending strategy, which was well laid down by Keynes and by Minsky, is something that you can put into this mix and see what happens. And what we found, which was absolutely fantastic in a way, was that this counter-cyclical spending strategy really does play a role, a restraining role, a calming role in our unstable economy. In other words, we started with a simple question: can we do anything about growth when we have positive interest rates? And we ended up actually with implications saying not only yes we can, not only that we can create that, but also that with the appropriate sense of what government's role is, we can maintain it in the face of certain shocks. And that idea that government has a role to play, it's a deeply unfamiliar, unacknowledged one in a climate such as the one that we have at the moment. It feels like very countercultural in the sense that when we look at the politics around us, we can see governments that are protecting private interests, that are arguing for a hollowing out of government, that are arguing for efficiencies at the government level to make way for, to give free rein to the market to do its job. And what this simple macroeconomic analysis says, the markets are not going to do their job under certain conditions. The government actually does have a social role to play. And from macroeconomics, we come back to a fundamental point. Actually, government does have a role to play. Government has a social contract between citizens, between market, between state. It is about a stabilizing influence, a guiding hand, the ability, in fact, to create prosperity, to be a progressive guardian for prosperity in a meaningful way. And one of the principal things that stopped it playing that role, very specifically, is the nature of the money system in which government itself has to borrow at interest from private individuals to maintain the social welfare of its citizens. A kind of horror scenario that you could only make up in a dystopian film in which nobody knew the workings of the system itself. And so this process actually of unfolding these things has delivered us into insights which should make us active as citizens, which should make us progressive as government, that should tell us actually that the solutions to the things that we face are not impossible. They don't lie outside the lexicon of the understandings of very, very bright economists from generations. They lie within our own remit to imagine, to create, to co-create, to build, and to reinvent a sense of prosperity. And just to finish, we're not at all alone in that dream. This is one of the most famous of all economists. I'm not charmed with the ideal of life held out by those who think that the normal state of human beings is that of struggling to get on, that the trampling, crushing, elbowing and treading on each other's heels which form the existing type of social life are the most desirable lot of humankind. The best state of human nature, said John Stuart Mill, the father of economics, is that which, while no one is poor, no one desires to be richer, nor has any reason to fear being thrust back by the efforts of others to push themselves forward. Mill wasn't saying it's the most likely state of nature, but he was saying It is the best. He was telling us that there is a part of the human spirit that goes beyond selfish, novelty-seeking hedonism, that reaches out to other, that cares about tradition, that is embedded in its community. A sense of ourself, actually, that we are able to recover when we begin this simple task of redefining prosperity. It isn't about having more and more of those material possessions that refugees cling to when they leave their burning homes. It is about recognizing the symbolic importance of those things, the underlying social ties that give rise to that importance, the kind of relationships that define us as human beings, the kind of economics that support those relationships. It is about reinventing in a meaningful, definable, pragmatic, straightforward way the economics that supports the prosperity of the future. A prosperity that consists ultimately in our ability to flourish as human beings on a finite planet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tim. And just a housekeeping to bring us a little bit to time. Because we are in a conversation space with the community, there is a children's concert immediately after this event. So I have promised that the grown-ups will be vacating this room at 1. So what we're going to do is to invite you to continue the conversation with Tim in the foyer. But in the meantime, I've asked Rafe Manges if he could give us a few minutes in response from the city, and we'll continue the conversation afterwards. Thank you so much, Tim.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tim. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll keep it quite simple. A couple of great quotes from Tim's speech. One of the most important ones, I think, is how economics is confused, as Tim said, the underlying motivations. So the incentives are all wrong. Economics really is a descriptive academic subject, which became a predictive one, and it doesn't do that very well at all. So actually, why do we have an economy? Why do we study economics? What's it all for? Or actually, to describe it, another UK economist, Diane Coyle, who you might know, who wrote a book called The Economics of Enough. What are we actually trying to get to, and how can economics help us? The participation piece is really important. It's a conversation that we're starting to have in the city now about what does it mean to be a citizen, and how do citizens actually participate in their society, not just their economy. Some of the things we've got going on here, we've got a Living Economies Expo in 6 weeks, which is going to start to consider some of these questions. New organisations springing up in Christchurch like OHU, which is looking at new models of development and social finance, mirroring some of the things that Tim was talking about, especially around community banking and community finance. The Social Enterprise World Forum is coming here at the end of the year, which again is going to explore some of the more peer-to-peer social enterprise aspects. And this idea of actually what is the point of the system that we have is very, very important. And Tim, I think, is doing exceptional work in bringing together perhaps some of the stuff we understand around environmental issues and ecosystem services and putting it together with the monetary impact and the way the money system is constructed. As he noted, the money system has us by the short and curlies, but that can change. And the financial crisis of 2008 actually exposed that, and groups like Positive Money and QE for the People springing up in Europe are actually starting to focus on actually how the monetary system works. The Bank of England has started to recognise this, and actually it's been quite a cleansing process. The idea that we can have prosperity without growth is very, very possible, but we need to understand how all our systems are working together, the environment and the economy, and the social piece, which is actually why we're bothering to do this at all. So I just want to say thanks very much to Tim. This is a really important piece of work, and it's really important for us to consider this in a much more holistic way. So we're very supportive of this in the city, and we hope we can build on some of this work. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. My name is Mark Crane. I'm the founding director of the Hillary Institute of International Leadership, and it's been our enormous pleasure to be able to bring Tim to you today here in the home city of the Institute here in Canterbury. Over the last decade, we have been investing in extraordinary leaders in mid-career around the planet, and Tim joins a remarkable family which includes Peggy Liu in China, Mike Broom, the head of the Sierra Club, President Anoti Tong, our tuakana Tainer up in Kiribati, and Atelsa Sultani, the founder of Amazon Watch. I think you clearly will appreciate that the caliber of these leaders we need more of. The investment we make in people like Tim Jackson is something that we as a society need to honour, we need to toe-to-toe, we need to get firmer and stronger in these very challenging existential challenges that we confront. But most of all, Tim is, frankly, an inspiration. And please join me once again. Thank you. With 30 seconds to go, Bronnie has asked me to do some very quick housekeeping. Please join us in the foyer, she said, for further discussion there. You will find Tim's latest book, Minister Go Through Wise Edition, at a very good discount. And I'm sure he'll be happy to sign copies while he's there. And also there will be another of these gatherings in a month's time, Bronnie, with a key guest right here from Norway. So congratulations to the university, thanks to New Zealand and the university. And we look forward to keeping these conversations together. Thank you.